This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Institute of International and European Affairs, we're very pleased to welcome you for the inaugural event in this year's Development Matters series, which is kindly sponsored by Irish Aid, the Irish Government's Development Cooperation Programme. We're delighted to be joined today by Felipe López-Calva, who's been generous enough to take time out of his particularly busy schedule at the present time to speak to us. Mr. López-Calva will speak to us for about 20 minutes, and then we will go, as usual, to a question and answer session. You'll be able to join the discussion using the Q&A function on Zoom, which you'll see on your screens. Please feel free to send in questions or comments as they occur to you throughout the session, and we'll come to as many of them as we can when our speaker has finished his presentation. A reminder that today's presentation and the Q&A are both on the record. Please feel free to join the discussion on Twitter or X using the handle @IIEA. And we're also live streaming today's discussion, so a very warm welcome to those of you tuning in via YouTube. With that, I'd like to ask Sarah Hunt, who's the Director of Policy Unit at Irish Aid, to say a few introductory remarks about our speaker. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you all here today to the first of our 2025 Development Matters lectures with Luis Felipe López-Calva, the World Bank's Global Director for Poverty and Equality. Before we begin, I would like to thank Alex White, the Director General of IIEA, and Jill Donoghue and her team for all the work that goes into this lecture series. It's a very valuable forum for Irish Aid and the Department of Foreign Affairs, a space to convene global experts and leaders to share knowledge and insight on key development issues, and equally to share some of our work with the public and communicate our development priorities. Luis Felipe will today speak about pathways out of the polycrisis. It is a more than timely title, given recent geopolitical upheavals, which seem to be continuing a shared global experience of unprecedented change in recent years. Although, as a term, it has been around for decades, I'm not sure how many of us were familiar with the concept of polycrisis, even just a few years ago. Yet the word immediately makes sense to us, capturing the multiple overlapping and ongoing challenges facing the world. The World Bank's 2024 Poverty, Prosperity and Planet Report examines these challenges, the ongoing conflicts, economic stagnation, and the persistent and scarring effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the worsening climate emergency. We know that progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals has slowed significantly. And this report is an important post-pandemic examination of poverty reduction efforts. It provides the evidence that recovery in the poorest countries has continued to lag. Poverty reduction has stalled compared to all of the efforts in the pre-COVID period, and that's even before considering the impact of the polycrisis on food security, on social protection systems, human rights, and gender equality. This is concerning for us all and a priority for Ireland, given our focus on reaching those furthest behind first in our development cooperation and those most affected by these crises. Alongside stalled poverty reduction, growth projections for the poorest economies remain low, and debt repayments are at historically high levels, limiting the resources available for education, healthcare, and basic needs. Meanwhile, as the report notes, the impact of climate change is affecting at least 1 in 5 people. The report highlights how progress in reducing global extreme poverty depends on the reduction of poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. At a time when ODA budgets are being cut by many donors, it will be interesting to hear more of how this can direct future action, particularly with the report warning that 2020 to 2030 is already on track to be another lost decade. The report also draws attention to the question of aid fragmentation, and it will be interesting to hear your reflections on whether this is likely to change in response to recent ODA cuts in the US, future ones in the UK, and also a changing focus in Europe. We can, though, take some hope from the report. There are clear areas where progress can be made, such as through faster and more inclusive economic growth, investments in human capital and targeted social safety nets, as well as providing protection from climate shocks and enhanced risk management. I look forward to hearing Luis Felipe speak to these pathways out of this polycrisis and for your reflections on how changes in ODA commitments may impact on this. Again, Thank you all for joining us today, both in person and online. And I will now hand you back to David, who will moderate today's event.
Please, Felipe, over to you.
Thank you. First of all, I really want to thank all the Irish cooperation authorities and the Institute for hosting this event and for the support that they have provided to our work. And as I will mention in a minute, some of the key aspects of the report that we prepared were possible thanks to that support. It is a privilege also to be in this country, which I really admire for its development trajectory, and we have learned a lot from all that you have done in this country, and we really try to bring some of these ideas to other regions and to other countries. So. What I want to start by saying that 2 years ago in the World Bank, we had a very open discussion about the mission of the World Bank and to rethink how the bank could be more effective in supporting all the countries, particularly those that are struggling more with achieving higher levels of growth and poverty reduction. As a result, we got a new mission document approved by our board with a very succinct definition of our mission that was stated as the mission of the bank is ending poverty on a livable planet. So that is important for two reasons. One is because ending poverty remained as the most important objective for us in the World Bank, and consistent with the fact that we have SDG number 1 as elimination of poverty in all its forms. But it was also challenging that we have to incorporate, as it should be, of course, necessary to do, is to bring other considerations, in this case, the livable planet. And the livable planet was a concept that included first climate action, both in the sense of adaptation and vulnerability, as well as mitigation, and try to achieve a development model that is less harmful for the climate. But it also includes issues like fragility and conflict, pandemics. So livable planet deliberately was a concept that was beyond climate and tried to incorporate dimensions that matter for us as global challenges. So with that new mission or new mission statement in mind, we went back to our global monitoring report that we publish every other year that used to be called the Poverty and Shared Prosperity Report. And we produced this new report that will now be called from now on Poverty, Prosperity, and Planet. I want to share with you a few messages, perhaps what I consider the most important messages of this report, but also happy to elaborate as we move into the conversation. So first, the world achieved a lot in terms of poverty reduction. More than 1 billion people were lifted out of poverty in the last 2 decades, but this process slowed down. And during the COVID crisis, there was an important increase in poverty, and the recovery has been positive mainly for middle-income countries and high-income countries. But the poverty today, extreme poverty today, is higher than pre-pandemic levels in low-income countries. So for low-income countries, the impact of the pandemic has been a permanent impact, okay? That explains in part why we can see a trend that is not very positive if we think of SDG 1 as ending poverty by 2030. So important message is that we are off track to achieve that specific goal if we don't do things different. Mainly, but not only, because in those places where there is persistent poverty, extreme poverty, we also have very low rates of economic growth. First. Second is because also the growth is less effective in reducing poverty when there is high level of inequality. And I want to have a parenthesis here, and I'm happy to see our friends from Oxfam, because they were very, very strong allies in this discussion in the bank, that for the first time, inequality is explicitly stated in the mission of the bank, added as the bank also has to be working on reducing the number of countries with high inequality. In the past, we used the term shared prosperity to talk about inclusiveness of growth, but now we have explicitly the concept of inequality as something we should be concerned about, and we also present numbers in terms of the evolution of these countries. Of course, there was debate about how to measure better inequality, and we know that it's a complex indicator, but this is the second message I want to present to you, is that cross-country inequality has fallen mainly because of the convergence in terms of income levels with large countries in Asia, China and India, that have grown rapidly, and this convergence has reduced cross-country inequality. But within country inequality is a very heterogeneous story. In some regions has gone slightly down, in other regions it has increased when it comes to income inequality. But still, we have more than 50 countries right now in the world that are considered high inequality countries, if we take the indicator defined in our document, which takes from the UN SDG report the threshold of a Gini coefficient for income of 0.4. Okay, so every country that has a Gini coefficient above 0.4 is considered a high inequality country. Third indicator that we report is, which is a new indicator, and this is one, for example, in which we were able to geo-reference all the household surveys thanks to the support of Irish cooperation in our work. We had a very ambitious project to geo-reference all the household surveys, and that allowed us to create this new indicator that we call vulnerability to climate shocks. So this is a new indicator that includes in the battery of high-level objectives is to reduce the vulnerability to climate shocks, the number of people that are vulnerable to climate shocks. How do we do it? First, we select geographically. We look at people who are subject to four types of climate shocks that are specifically flood, drought, extreme heat, and cyclones. So we look at all the population that are exposed to these shocks, and then we come up with a multidimensional index that looks at whether people are able to cope with these shocks. And we overlap these two indicators, and we see, for example, that regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, practically everybody who is exposed to shocks is vulnerable, which means there is no capacity to cope with the shocks because there is no access to services, there is no access to social protection and other mechanisms. So while other regions, the share of population that are exposed, some of them are not necessarily vulnerable, but overall we find that more than 700 million people in the world are at risk of falling into poverty due to climate shocks. So we try to bring the interlinkage between climate and poverty in a very explicit way in the report. So these are some of the main messages driven by the measurement of the indicators that we have. But a very important, to close this part, a very important qualitative message is extreme poverty globally has become fundamentally concentrated in Sub-Saharan Africa. And 2/3 of the extreme poor are living in fragile or conflict-affected settings. So this is really the area of higher interest if we want to eliminate global extreme poverty. Maybe also another point, which is, as you know, the global extreme poverty is measured in monetary terms as $2.15 per person per day. We now, as a recommendation of experts and approved by the board, we also present now numbers for higher standards of poverty. So, for example, for upper middle income countries, we have a poverty line of $6.85 per person per day. If we take that standard, which is not a very high standard of living, 44% of the global population could be considered poor. So that tells you the magnitude of and the need to think about growth, but again, not any type of growth. Growth that is more inclusive and growth that is more climate friendly. In the pathways, we discuss in a very honest way, because it is important to acknowledge what our counterparts in the countries tell us, that they face very important trade-offs and constraints. So if you look at long-term in our country climate and development reports, always the trade-off between poverty reduction and climate is sort of reduced because in the long term, the growth effect dominates. But in the short term, countries are faced with very difficult decisions. So what we try to do is to try to propose some prioritization and say, well, depending on the context, the emphasis should be on a specific aspect. But also we show a simulation of what would be the cost in terms of emissions if we eliminate extreme poverty. And the cost is very low, okay? So the climate concern, which is very important, and we will discuss it in a minute, is not, should not be an excuse not to eliminate extreme poverty. Actually, the extreme poor people live in countries that are right now contributing relatively little to global emissions. So there is a possibility to grow faster, eliminate extreme poverty, and the cost in terms of emissions is not very high. But if you start increasing the ambition, for example, if you take the poverty line of $6.85 and you want to bring everybody above that line, then the cost in terms of emissions increases rapidly, okay? So we do have to consider, after we care about extreme poverty, we really need to transition to a growth model that is less emissions intensive. And for that, what do people do? What do countries need? One, technology, a massive technological transformation with technology that to a large extent is available. But the problem is we need the finance. Why? Because that technology has to flow to the places where it's needed, and that requires resources. So really the reduction of the trade-off between poverty reduction, economic growth, and emissions, reducing emissions, can be solved through these two mechanisms, technology and finance. So conceptually it's clear, but in practice it's complex, right? And we were just discussing, and we're going to elaborate on the issue that if development finance is reduced, the issue of financing becomes even more important, okay? So those are some of the important messages in terms of the pathways. If we go to the priorities, basically we try to classify countries in terms of the challenges, and we say in those low-income countries in which we really want to focus to eliminate extreme poverty, emphasis should be put in terms of basic human capital and physical capital. So you have to invest in education, invest in health. We show some numbers of the per capita investment in education, for example, in low-income countries versus high-income countries, and you can see that it goes from, in a low-income country, in average, it could be $45 per person, per student in education, while in a high-income country is more than $10,000 per person, okay? So this is the level of the gap that exists. So in a way, it's also a call to go back to the basics, in the sense you need to grow in a more inclusive way. You need to equip those that are more vulnerable and live in a condition of poverty to participate more actively in the process of economic growth. Growth can be made more inclusive by bringing productive capacity at the bottom of the income distribution and lifting the constraints for those at the bottom to be more actively participating in the process of growth. If you have a process of growth that is more inclusive, dynamically, you reduce inequality as well. Okay? So you have both mechanisms to reduce inequality. One is redistribution via fiscal systems, but the other is by redistributing productive capacity, bringing more productive capacity to the bottom of the distribution. So the process of growth itself becomes bottom up. So that's one fundamental priority. The second is mechanisms to protect people from shocks, as I said before, which is more the adaptation type of agenda and the vulnerability agenda, not only through social protection mechanisms, but also by developing markets, insurance markets, and other access to finance and so on, and dealing with aspects related to environment that are more under control of the domestic governments. Example, air pollution. We take a deep dive on air pollution. 6% of global GDP is the cost annually of health-related impact of air pollution. And you go to places like South Asia, air pollution is really a big issue. And we have shown with very detailed analysis that the poorest are the most affected by air pollution because it has impact on school attendance, it has impact because of health, it has impact on productivity, also because through health, because are the ones that have the longest commuting times. So all that makes the poor particularly vulnerable to air pollution. So this is the type of win-win policies that we propose, and there are other aspects like that we present very clearly, climate-friendly agriculture and so on. So there are very specific recommendations there. And finally, definitely the mitigation side. So you really need to invest with a just transition lens in the sense of bringing the technological change that is needed, the technological transformation that is needed, and making sure that you protect those that can lose because of the transition, or you reskill or retrain workers that could be affected by the technological transition. So this sounds very abstract at this point, but it's really, we provide very specific examples. Just to land, so this is at a global level, the narrative that we present in the report, but now we have an instrument that allows us to bring it at a very context-specific discussion, country by country, and these are called the poverty and equity assessments. So part of the new decisions in the context of the new agenda is that poverty and equity assessments would be what we call a core analytical piece that feeds into the country partnership framework of the bank, not only in IDA countries, but also in IBRD countries, which basically means also for middle income countries, not only for low income countries. So that means that this document will feed into the operation of the bank, and that allows us to be very specific country by country, looking at these aspects that I just discussed. So the opportunities and the challenges in each country are discussed in poverty and equity assessments, and we can share with you the stock or the inventory of poverty and equity assessments that you can look at, and we are producing a flow of assessments as we speak. So that leads into the final point I want to make, which is that the idea is not only to leave it at a very abstract analytical level, which is what the report does, but the idea is to really make immediately affect, in a positive sense, the way in which we operate on the ground. So the idea is to really feed into the dialogue, feed into the operations with this lens. And as I always tell our teams in our poverty and equity practice, we are the voice of the poor within the bank. In the sense, we really try to make the bank work with particularly positive impact for those at the bottom of the income distribution in each country. The context is becoming more difficult. We can talk about that in a minute, but it's important to say that while we are strategic about the way in which we engage, we do not compromise on the purpose. And we were very happy to see in our recent mission document that the board supported, again, this idea that the main objective of the bank is ending poverty, but we have to do it by building also a livable planet. So let me leave it there now, and we can elaborate in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felipe. Really, first of all, warm congratulations on the report. It's really excellent, and I must say, it from an Irish perspective, it makes a number of powerful points which kind of resonate with us, tackling extreme poverty, addressing the needs of the poorest people, the poorest countries. As you know, Irish Aid has embodied that same philosophy in the notion of reaching the furthest behind first. But we see that the international consensus on that is unraveling a bit. I mean, a few years ago with the SDGs, every country was committed to leaving no one behind. Now we see certain countries clearly departing from that. What can the bank do politically to try to save that consensus, or to try to, I mean, intervene with its own shareholders, with the governments? I mean, what can the bank do at political level to try to shore up that consensus? What you are doing in this report is really a superb example of data being mobilized, and you talk about the communications effort that you want to lead, and all of that is music to our ears. But I'm just wondering, politically, what can the bank do to try to keep what remains of that consensus?
So it's a complicated question, particularly because I don't want to speak on behalf officially of the World Bank, but I can tell you the type of conversations that we have in the technical teams and the operational teams. And I think what is important is that our mission document, our mandate, will respond to our governance structure, and that governance structure endorsed this mission document and these mission objectives and the new corporate scorecard, and that has not changed. So we continue committed to those to that mandate, to those principles. We don't see that for now changing, so we're committed to that, and the operations are ongoing, and we try to make it work for the poorest in every context in which we work. Second, we do see even a Nobel Prize economist Angus Deaton in a recent book talked about this idea of what we calls the end of cosmopolitan prioritarianism. So the idea that the average citizen in a rich country is less supportive of the idea of supporting poorest people in the world, and are more focused on what happens to their own community, to their own local community. And I think that analysis is quite interesting. These political dynamics that, of course, affect. We would like to think that it affects, in the short term, the support for certain types of policies, but the structural problems are long-term challenges, and we have to continue working on that. And I would argue that what we were discussing before this meeting, the idea of having evidence-based narratives that make the point, not necessarily from a normative perspective, even though we live, it's a normative issue, poverty, but also from an instrumental perspective. The stability of countries, the stability globally, the migration flows related to fragility and conflict, all those things can be potentially influenced positively in the sense of reducing these tensions by addressing issues related to poverty and the well-being of those at the bottom. So I think it's a time to make perhaps more emphasis on the instrumental reasons rather than the normative ones, because the space for a normative discussion perhaps is not there. But I think there are very solid instrumental reasons to try to pursue this agenda.
Yeah. I'd like to invite the audience just to contribute any questions or comments. Yes, please, over here.
Yeah, I was at another lecture here previously, and they mentioned that for Ireland, 6 counties, it would take 20 billion for 30 years to bring them up to an EU standard, which is about 600 billion quid we need over the next 30 years. Now, in the context of your talk, you said there were 700 million people globally in extreme poverty. How much would it take per year to bring them out of that, and over what period of time? And you said 2 billion people, well, I'm saying they're about 44% of the population of the world, is on $6.35. And they're $2,500 per year. How much would it take for the bank to, would it be 20 billion? Would it be 200 billion? Would it be $1 trillion? How much would it take, and how many years would it need to do it, to get them out of it?
Very good question. You may need a calculator, but I'll take a couple more before, while I let Luis Felipe do the calculations instead. Yes, please, sir. And you might introduce yourselves just.
Hello, I'm Aslak Brun. I'm the Norwegian ambassador to Ireland, and I used to head up the sustainable development work in Ministry of in Norway before coming here. It's very good that you talk about making the argument more instrumental. You know that investing in poverty reduction actually is a good thing for economy, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because we actually get money back there. But the context that we are in, and Arjay alluded to that, there will be less money investing, at least from the traditional OECD countries. So we need to do the right thing. And you talked about pathways and priorities. Probably one of the best ways to get the really poor people out of poverty is to give them cash, or to give them social protection, very targeted. If you look at our own countries, we all have it. But it's been a political process. It's been, people asking for it, demanding it, a political structure. So in some of these countries that are in conflict, it hasn't happened yet. So do you have advice as an economist how we can make this a more feasible political choice for the politicians in charge, that this is actually the right way to do it? It would be, giving more power to the people that are not so empowered in those countries. So it's a highly political question. But the point is it also an economic question? Can you also be instrumental in the way that you talk with shareholders and member governments about why this is a good way to really get to everybody, and the whole economy would benefit from it? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You might take those two to begin with.
Yes, I think these are fascinating questions. I could speak about this for hours, but let me try to simplify because they are related. One way to think about ending poverty is to think about what is the gap, as you mentioned, and say, well, this is the amount of money that is needed. But that will be the amount of money needed in 1 year to transfer to people, plus the cost of creating the systems to transfer the money. And you would need that every year, which is not the right approach. What we believe the right approach is to create the conditions for people to generate productively their own income. So in that sense, what you need is to assess what is needed to create the conditions for that in terms of infrastructure, in terms of human capital, that creates the conditions for that to happen. Because at the end, economic growth is only driven by private sector. So you need to create the conditions for the private sector-led job creation that actually allows people to generate the income. So I think that is the type of thinking that we would like to bring to the conversation, rather than thinking about how much money rich countries have to transfer every year so everybody gets the right amount of cash. And that related to this. We believe that the cash transfers have been a very powerful instrument to assist people, particularly in the situations of crisis. Even during the pandemic, we saw that with differential effectiveness, by the way. In the lowest income countries were less effective in reaching actually the people, because they don't have the systems, the governance structures to do it effectively, but certainly was a very powerful instrument to compensate for the shock. But again, I think the idea of, for example, the idea of universal basic income that was very popularized here. The original idea of universal basic income in Atkinson's thinking, it was in rich countries where capital is more concentrated than labor income. you create a tax on capital, and through the universal basic income, you make the return on capital more equally distributed, right? The idea was not that that would be the way to sustain poverty reduction. So I think the idea of having some type of, for example, in countries with extractive industries where the national wealth is really driving growth, maybe it's a good idea to try to think how that wealth is distributed in some type of transfer. But we firmly believe in the idea that what we need to do is to create the conditions for the people to be actively engaged in the process of economic growth. Economic growth has to be a private sector driven process of growth, but it requires a strong state that creates the conditions for that to happen. So the emphasis is really, as we call it, going from the lending bank to the leveraging bank. So the World Bank has to lend in a way that creates the conditions for the private sector to kick in and drive a process of job creation that is more sustainable. Even if you think in terms of the link between humanitarian and development assistance, the bridge between these two is agency. What you want to do is give people back their agency so they become owners of their own process of improvement. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. Raymond Johnson, principal consultant at International Trade. You did mention that one of the quickest routes out of poverty is transition. So given that Africa has abundance of sunshine, sun energy, and which is enough to power the whole continent and export some. And of course, transfer of technology. You did also mention that. What model do you have to take advantage of this opportunity?
I'll take another one. Yes, right beside you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for having me. Joe Afolan is my name, development consultant. I heard the gentleman spoke about the impact of flooding and drought and how it affects poverty. I worked in Nigeria, in the Gambia, Mozambique, and I saw how farmers were impacted by the impact of flooding and drought. How they were able not to be able to feed their family because you have sustained farmers, and how it even affected food security across those countries as well. But I just want to get your take. What was the take of the World Bank in relation to adaptation strategies? A lot of these African countries are actually engaging in adaptation strategies, but funding is an issue. So what's the position of the First Bank? Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. So in terms of the first question, something that we say in the report, and I admit it was controversial within the discussion in the bank, is the idea that, for example, in this case, Sub-Saharan Africa should be given the opportunity to move into cleaner energies before going to the cleanest energy, right? So have a transition from less clean to the cleanest process, for example, of generating energy, even though, for example, through gas, to mention one example. So if we impose a constraint on a country that doesn't have the financing or easily accessible the technology, even though we know that this is possible, we need to have a realistic path towards that. So right now, the bank has committed to make sure that 300 million people in Sub-Saharan Africa are connected to electricity in the next 4 years. But that would allow for technologies that are cleaner, even when they are not, of course, whenever possible, the cleanest technology should be used. But the idea is to have a transition towards more sustainable energy and energy sources that are cleanest. But the commitment is there to electrify, to bring electricity to 300 million people in Africa, and we hope that we will deliver on that. Second, on on the flooding and the resources. Let me put it in a way that sort of simplifies. We say that this is the DRM squared is the formula. Disaster risk management has to be supported by domestic resource mobilization. So you need, you have countries that first you generate resources, then you can create the mechanisms for disaster risk management, which is very, very important, and including mechanisms to respond through social protection mechanisms, and something we have been testing, for example, in the case of Bangladesh, where you have early warning when you actually you trigger, for example, transfers to people before the event, and they can cope better with the event under certain very clear, objective, and transparent indicators. So there are issues that relate to fiscal systems, but also issues relate to civil protection, to, in some cases, investment in infrastructure that is more resilient, and so on. So I think this formula of DRM and DRM, the domestic resource mobilization for disaster risk management. And I think that approach can build the conditions for a more resilient, to have more resilient communities. But again, it takes time to build.
I might throw in just a question of my own about the multidimensionality of poverty to which you referred. And obviously the World Bank's entire approach is based on the idea of recognizing that all these sectors are integrated with each other, and that you can have synergies between one sector and another, but equally there are trade-offs, difficult trade-offs to be worked out. We have a number of questions coming in online, including from Seamus Allen, who's a researcher here, about the links between these different areas. And do you think that governments internationally have grasped sufficiently the interconnectedness between, let's say, between health and education? And is this still a work in progress? It was something which underpins the designing of the SDGs, but the bank has been to the fore in advocating that governments understand the multidimensionality of poverty reduction. But how much of a journey do we have still ahead of us before states fully grasp this and then take kind of the actions needed?
I would answer this in two stages. The first one is, here I might be biased because of my you know me, my career has been between the UN and the bank. So in that sense, I also see the perspective particularly from UNDP, but I have been always very much an advocate of the multidimensionality of poverty, which at the beginning, when this was launched in 2010, was not immediately embraced in the bank. Right now, I think now it's very much a standard analysis that we do in every country. So the first part of my answer would be that I think there is an intellectual victory of the notion of multidimensionality in the international community, for which I celebrate. However, I don't think this has been translated into the way we do policy. So we still, even when we measure poverty multidimensionally, we go back to sector-specific recommendations without thinking about the interlinkages, right? So there are efforts in that direction. We are right now, and I will be super happy to share and show to the people interested. So we're trying to use complexity analysis to try to understand this interaction. So what do we do? This is still at an experimental stage, but we look at the different dimensions, a little bit of a technical point. If you have a multidimensional poverty index, what you have there is the state variable in each dimension, but each dimension has its own dynamics and interacts with the others. For example, very obviously, health and education. So what we do is try to see empirically what is the connection among these variables, and what are the nodes in that system that can have the biggest impact in the whole index, right? One example, you can think immediately, I mean, one thing we did to prioritize is invest in education. Makes a lot of sense. When we see empirically in many countries, when we look at the data, is that housing conditions becomes very, very important, what we call poverty centrality, has a lot of poverty centrality. Sorry if this is a little bit technical, but the idea is housing conditions can impact the health of children, then impacts school attendance, right? So eventually it has an impact on health and education. So maybe if you have one marginal dollar to spend, maybe you should invest it in housing if you are thinking multidimensionally, and not necessarily in the traditional ranking that we have. You see, the way we think different about policy, when we bring the multidimensional concept, is not well established in the way we do policy. So again, bottom line is we're trying to bridge that gap and trying to use multidimensionality to do policy differently, okay? But that requires some technical instruments that is still to be developed, but we are in the process of doing that. If you go to, we can share the link to our work. By the way, Kim here, my colleague, is also a co-author of that work. You can have this analysis for 67 countries already in that public database, and happy to share that. But I'm really glad that you mentioned this, because I think multidimensionality conceptually is well established, but not yet fully exploited in the policy sphere. Yeah.
Any further questions? Yes, please.
I'm Dr. Alan Sloan from University College in Cork. And we were here yesterday talking about Irish agriculture and climate impacts of agricultural practice in Ireland. And I was struck that, you have a marginal abatement curve in the usual way, and that a lot of the policies that would come first on that curve, the ones the lowest cost, biggest impact, were fairly low-tech ones, different soil management, waste management, things like that. Matt would correct me and develop that further. He's the expert on this at this point. And then you also spoke about local agency and local initiative, and about technology transfer. So I was wondering, are there opportunities in the context of individual countries in Africa, for example, where local and indigenous knowledge and practices might actually be more effective or more cost effective than, say, importing high technology from the West?
Thanks, Alan. You might take another one. Yes, please. Read.
Hi, Breeden McGrath from Oxfam. And just to say, the inequality indicator is most welcome, and we think it'll strengthen SDG 10 in terms of reducing inequalities, and that's very good. Just to bring you back to the example you used of Ireland, and you say that you go around globally using Ireland as an example. There's a lot of reasons for that. Then some of them people agree or disagree, but one is very clearly regional integration, right? So I wonder the extent to which the bank views that or looks at that in relation to your modelling, political and economic, because I think everyone would say that was possibly the key lever for Ireland, or one of them anyway.
Please, Felipe, maybe take those two.
Thank you. On the first one, I think this is super interesting, and my answer will be first that the experts on this topic are not in my practice. We have a full team working on climate and so on. We just, the bank just created a new position called the Chief Climate Economist. And there is a new report coming on specifically on the idea of the livable planet and so on. So a lot of analysis there that is from people who know much more about this. But I can tell you that what I have seen in the team working on the ground, this is very context specific. So I think there are opportunities, yes, and they're relatively low cost in many cases. And by the way, in some cases, these are practices that have been maintained for a lot of time and have been proven to be successful. So I think that should be protected and scaled up. But that's very context specific. But of course, in that sense, there is no recipe. I think the idea is to be very pragmatic, and there are many policies that can be decided. And insisting that the bank supports these processes, but at the end, these policy decisions are sovereign decisions, right?
And the Oxfam.
The Oxfam. So Definitely the real integration, you mean across countries or within? Yes, no, definitely. I think so. One of the aspects we have discussed also with our colleagues in the governance practice and in the governance WDR and so on, is the idea that coordination in institutional evolution, let's say, what you want to create is credible institutional change. And that is what really crowds in investment and so on. Part of the problem that is generated by no integration is the possibility of policy change, constant policy change. So regional integration also brings credible commitments, right? And that really creates a condition for private sector. So in that sense, we strongly believe in that. However, I'm going to mention just in parentheses, and I will speak about this not as a World Bank, but as a Mexican citizen. The discussion in '94 in Mexico was how to create sustained institutional change in Mexico in a credible way. And the way to do it was North American Free Trade Agreement. And you can go, there are very good pieces of analysis. We're talking about the political economy of Mexico centered to NAFTA, for example. The Aaron Tornell wrote that on the National Bureau of Economic Research. A very nice analysis. Precisely Mexico benefited a lot. At that moment, for example, Mexico was exporting 90% of exports were oil. Right now, the exports, the trade between Mexico and the US is bigger than the GDP of Argentina, just to give you an idea of how much we achieved. Yet now, the decision to withdraw from that deal didn't come from Mexico. So unfortunately, there we have an experiment that we can see how that uncertainty is being created. And you know, you would have thought that the instability would come from Mexico, and it's not coming from Mexico. But that's just the reason why I'm mentioning this is because that's a very specific example of how credible integration led to so much generation of positive economic dynamics. So we firmly believe in that. But I think now the context is a bit more complicated.
It sure is. Ms. Felipe, a question from Roisin O'Brien. She says, many African countries have a large informal sector, and therefore development seems to focus on increasing the productivity of agriculture and or supporting entrepreneurial efforts. The private sector drives growth. What can be done to increase the formal private sector in Africa and to drive job creation rather than continually focusing on individuals in poverty? In other words, the formal private sector, what can be done in that direction?
That's a very difficult question to answer, but I can tell you that the trends in the thinking about that that are moving, I think, in the direction of thinking of informality in a more systemic way, because normally we think of informality as an issue. Some people look at informality as because of the fiscal cost of informality, because of taxes, or you look at the issues related precisely of low productivity or this kind of thing. But I think we have to think systemically, and there are three aspects that have to be integrated in thinking about informality. One is the tax system, the other is social protection, and the other is finance. So these three aspects, if thought carefully, systematically, not systematically, but systemically, can really create a lot of space for reduction of informality in a context in which what you have is labor markets that aren't clear, because you have a large supply of labor that remains in very low productivity activities. So, for example, if you create universal social protection systems in which the package of social protection that you provide is independent of your job situation, which means basically you delink the jobs from the contribution to social security, and you provide it through general taxes. That is one way to reduce the cost of hiring and the cost of formality. But in order to do that, you need the fiscal strength to be able to provide that universal social protection. So you have to think of taxation in a way that is consistent with that. And finally, it is impossible to grow small firms and to have dynamic entrepreneurial activity if the banking sector, if the finance sector is not providing these resources. So I think these three pillars are fundamental if you want to think seriously about informality. We think of financial inclusion still in a very limited way. Recent report by the bank on financial inclusion. Think of Guatemala, for example. You have 39% of the population declared to have a bank account. You say, okay, we're moving up in financial inclusion. But then you ask what they use the account for, and only 10% use it either for savings or for credit. The others only use it to receive transfers. And in some cases, transfers from remittances, for example, right? So financial inclusion, real financial inclusion is that when you have financial deepening by using it for savings, for lending to productive activities. So I think the financial sector is still underestimated in its potential impact to reduce informality and so on.
Thank you very much, Luis Felipe. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, we've run out of time. Time has flown by. Thank you very much, Luis Felipe, for your willingness to take a whole series of wide-ranging questions and for your initial presentation. We learned a huge amount. We're really delighted that you came here, as Michael Gaffey and his colleagues were saying earlier, and I hope you'll come again. In the meantime, the very best of luck with everything that the bank is trying to do in these challenging times. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.